actually get out on the water.
Oh, wow. Now, where are you, if I might ask?
Oh, we're in our backyard here. Yeah.
Oh, okay, at Buffalo or thereabouts.
Yeah, Laurel Street.
Yeah,
Well,
last week we were in we went on the lake in Michigan. We didn't go to New York Lake. We need to find a New York Lake. Okay. All right, we're on now.
We are officially live on Facebook. Thank you those who are joining us live. We will pay attention to the comments section and answer questions as we can, along with our study tonight. We usually shoot for a 45-minute session, and we're finishing up our topic tonight, looking specifically at Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. So we're on really the last 4 or 5 paragraphs. If you've had a chance to read ahead, if you have that document with you, you can always read along or read a section that specifically spoke to you. But we're going to dive.
Okay.
What's that, Dr. Jim?
Go on. I'm going to go get my copy. So
okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. So we will dive right in to looking at parts that stood out in this final page, in this final reading. And I will take the lead. If you look at
so we're kind of starting at the let me, right?
The capital L that begins with a sentence, let me rush on to mention my other disappointment.
And then that kind of through the rest of the letter.
Yeah.
Is what we're doing today.
On my page it's page 5.
But some people have different.
It might be
versions.
a different copy.
Yeah, I don't have page numbers, so I'm trying to find how far back it is.
It's I'm going to be on the final 7 paragraphs. So if it's 7 paragraphs to the end, you're in the right section.
Okay.
Martin Luther King talks about a particular pastor, Reverend Stallings. He mentions
Spring Hill College,
Montgomery. He's and it begins with, let me rush on to mention my other disappointment. And then he commends the Catholic leaders for integrating Spring Hill College in that paragraph. But if you go a couple of paragraphs down, he talks about numerous religious leaders of the South who have called upon their worshipers. And in that paragraph, he talks about something he's heard many ministers say. And there he says, there are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. So Martin Luther King Jr. talks about how he's heard that a bunch, where pastors say, there's this separation of the sacred and the secular. So there's this understanding that what's going on in the streets of Birmingham when it comes to injustice or racial unrest has nothing to do with what goes on on Sunday morning. And for Martin Luther King Jr., this was a horrific misunderstanding of what the gospel is. So I think in this final part of the letter, that's a big piece that's driven home, is Dr. King's understanding of the church's mission to not just include social justice as a topic, but that it's at the heart of what it means to bear witness to the gospel, to bear witness to Jesus. In fact, I would say it's at the heart of the gospel itself. So I think that's such a critical reminder that Dr. King's critique of the church was the way that they failed to engage society's issues during that time, and failed to be, they were silent, and they failed to be outspoken about issues that, in his opinion, were very much centered around what it means to follow Jesus, the good news of Jesus Christ, the love, peace, and justice that we've talked about from Micah chapter 6, that we've all been called to. So I think that's a very interesting paragraph there. He says, I've heard so many ministers say those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with. And Dr. King rejects this ideology of separating the two, but sees the gospel and what we do as a church as interconnected with how we treat our neighbor and the way we stand up against injustices that are going on in our society. And we very much have a responsibility to speak out to those things. So I think toward the end of this letter, that's one of the big points that stood out to me. Let me open it up. What has stood out to you in the latter part of this letter today?
I agree with what you said, and this one part that I read that had some meaning to me was when he said, and he was walking one sweltering summer, he walked around the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward, and I beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Bennett dripped with the words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright lights of creative protest? And I see so many reflections from that letter that are happening right now when we are seeing the uprising now of people, white people and Black people, in the nonviolent protests that are taking part, which really are to the heart of what Dr. Martin Luther King spoke to then and actually speaks to right now. And where are the churches that are silent?
Yeah.
What's happening with the churches that are condemning this, that are white churches condemning this? You know, so many thoughts in my mind with what's actually happening today on our streets in Buffalo and around the country, in the midst of all this COVID that's going on top of that. So it certainly is a time now in history, I think that is paramount to what is history and what will be history and where will it go.
Yes, I mean it's chilling to read this letter, and if we changed a couple of locations, a couple of
Like
wordings, he could have written it yesterday, and I would be think it was very contextual.
Yeah, I think especially this paragraph, this is what stood out to me, especially like in light of what you all just said. He says, but the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Obviously, we're 21st century now, but I've been in so many churches, I think, especially in the South, but that's just kind of where my ministry has been before here, that seemed like irrelevant social clubs that didn't take the gospel seriously, that didn't take Jesus Christ seriously, but it was like, you know, the car salesman would be a member of the church or be on the elders because they were the big voice in town, you know, in these small southern towns. And it was truly a social club. You listed that as like alongside your country club, that you were a member of First Pres or First Baptist or whatever. And I think that is so important to recognize that if we need to reclaim kind of what the church is and reclaim the church's voice. You know, he also says that the church there was a time when the church was powerful, you know, and I think about how less than 50 years ago, I think I said this here, all of the great leaders of the church, you know, I mean, our former moderator that we just elected would have met with the president of the United States like monthly. And now that would be a joke. Like it would be a joke if somebody tried to meet, you know, I mean, I can't imagine Gregory Bentley, who's from Alabama, trying to call up the president, no matter if they were Republican or Democrat, and say, you know, we want to meet with you. They'd probably laugh in their face, you know, like, who are you? But the church used to have this voice, and I think it's time for the church to reclaim that voice.
Yes, Karen, I want to give you an opportunity, and Paul, to respond to that first part. What has struck you in these final parts of the letter?
let me kind of amplify what all three of you said. And this comes from the paragraph before the one Caitlin referenced, which is about 2 after the one that Lynn referenced. One of the, I don't know if you've heard it, but I've heard it from time to time, constructive criticism / analysis of the church today is we've become too institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
We're concerned about buildings. We're concerned about rules. Where the early church was more of a faith community than a church. And resonating throughout the paragraphs with all of you is it seems to me he's saying we need to go back to that faith community, that spirituality, that energy of the early church, because we're becoming more and more irrelevant. And you know, one of the things you hear today about why, and forgive me, I'm a baby boomer. I often get you youngsters mixed up, but they often refer to the millennials aren't concerned about being in church on Sunday morning. They're concerned about serving. And in so many words, that's what he seems to be speaking about. What is this? This was done in 63, 40 or 50 years before we started talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's huge. I mean, literally his words are prophetic to a coming, decrease in churches that we see in the next 50 years from this letter. And, it's both horrific and exciting to think of this letter as something that we could use today. It's horrific because you would have hoped we had learned our lesson, but it's exciting because we have a chance right now to respond to one of the saints' voices, and get it right and start reacting in relevant ways to what's going on in our society. So there's hope in the sense it's not too late, and that maybe this is a moment of justice that we have a chance to live into Dr. King's dream and maybe even more. Dr. Jim, I want to give you an opportunity here with that first question.
What was the first question? I'm sorry.
We're just kind of looking at the final 7 or 8 paragraphs of the letter. We're on the final section of the letter tonight.
I had trouble summing it up.
Well,
okay, here's the thing. In 1963, I wanted to do a paper for my American literature class on Holden Caulfield and phony bastards, which is his famous phrase. Now, as a scholar, I got to tell you, I've never figured out why Great Gatsby has never been complained about in court. Because Daisy gets hit by a car on the street and her breast falls out. And, she's committing adultery and all kinds of things that, is going on with Gatsby. He's selling drugs. He's a bootlegger. And yet, in the Southern District of New York and many federal courts, there have been so many suits by parents for eliminating Catcher in the Rye, none for the Great Gatsby. In Catcher in the Rye, all he did, now you pardon my language, he went to visit his sister Phoebe. This relates to this. Holden goes to visit Phoebe, and somebody wrote "F-U" on the wall, like, Kilroy was here. And so Holden takes his sleeve and wipes it off the wall. And based on that passage, so much money has been spent trying to pull Catcher in the Rye off the shelves. And to me, you go, well, if you read Great Gatsby, how come there's not one suit? I mean, there's a lot going on there. Adultery, bootlegging, kind of the 10 Commandments. Well, back then I wanted to write a paper on that. And my professor, who was a Southern belle from Mississippi, she had just graduated from Oxford, the Miss or what, Miss U or whatever. And she said, no, James, the hot topic that you should be studying, And she was only about 8 years older than me. So the hot topic you should be studying is James Baldwin. He's the author of your generation, not J.D. Salinger. Well, she was wrong. I wrote a lot of papers for teaching school, how I was a catcher in the rye. And, for psychology school, I was a catcher in the rye, standing at the end of the field, saving children, how idealistic. No wonder I went to Berkeley. So in any case, so Baldwin wrote, a couple of novels for tolerance. He wrote, first of all, he wrote Go Tell It on the Mountain, a very striking testimony for Jesus. And then he also wrote, I think Baldwin saw that Americans read Letter from Birmingham jail and understood that the passage, which was imminent in 63 of the Civil Rights Bill, that this solved the situation. That back in 1963, when I had hair in the right place, none on my beard and a lot on my head, we had thought that this was going to be solved. Now, Paul, you study history, so I could be wrong here, but that we had solved the race problem, right? We passed a law. We have equal justice for all. La-di-da, it's over. And yet, Baldwin comes out with a play, which I read, which I think is good to read today, too. This is fabulous what we're reading, by the way. And it was called Blues for Mr. Charlie. And it was performed on Broadway. And, nobody's read this book in the last 50 years. But in this book, Blues for Mr. Charlie, he says, whoa, just a minute. This is not over. This is just beginning. And blues, like the rhythm and blues, hanging fruit and all that kind of stuff, that the blues for Mr. Charlie, meaning the white man, had just started. It was not over. Well, here we are. And, MLK, I taught at a school named MLK, obviously, when it comes to the government, we have equality. But the problem is, Barry Goldwater from then, in 1964, said, you cannot legislate the heart. So there's been, when I look at King, I'm going, was it a success? Because here we are, 50 or 60 years later, I can't count. And we have these riots on the street. This is post Eldridge Cleaver, post core Congress of Racial Equality. And my fear is and I'm often wrong, but if King's speech, which is a rhetorical success by any standard, didn't work, what's next? Blues for Mr. Charlie could be very bad, and we could be going into something that is very dark. And that for most of us who are Christians, our Christian morals will help us cope with what's going on. And for a couple of years now, I've been advocating that white Bible speakers, white Bible speakers, should try and get together with Black Bible speakers and begin to find things in common. However, what's odd about this election, which was also odd about the 64 election, is that there are a number of Bible speakers who are racists. We got the Free Methodists and the Evangelical United Brethren and, the Southern Baptist Church. And when you go to the television, I'm sorry, I'm long-winded, but when you go to the television, most of the preachers who are obstructionists speak Bible. And my mother always asked me why I liked Jesse Jackson. And by the time we were talking about that, I'd already written my doctoral dissertation on Bible speak in Puritan literature and how it affected that's not the official title, but how it affected American history. So I think we're at a perilous time because maybe this won't work. I don't know. It's kind of a dark side to to this issue. If people do not like a group of people, how does a government, which knows it has to survive, because we're a big continent, we're ripe for plucking, I'm a DOD guy in my early years, with the Department of Defense, we're ripe for plucking. If we're not united, we're not going to last.
Well, Dr. Martin, I agree with you. Maybe the time for listening to the prophetic words of God's messengers could be running out. We need to listen and act.
Yeah.
And I bring to our attention that we're listening to someone who's in jail.
Yeah.
This would have been seen as a incredibly radical move in that time. Although today most people uphold Dr. King, now that his words, now that he is safely not alive to cause trouble, most people are happy to honor him as a hero. But at this time, he was a jailbird and seen as an outside agitator. So I wonder what voices are speaking today who are living that, although it would be seen as radical, we should be listening to, as you say, before it's too late.
Yeah.
So I want to invite our Facebook viewers to put questions and thoughts. Even if you're watching this after the fact, we will check the comments and we'd love to engage with you. I'll move to our next question, and this kind of is leading right into that. How can the church become one that Martin Luther King Jr. would be proud of? It seems that Martin Luther King Jr. is directly challenging the church to get involved in this movement. And thinking about that in that time and then fast forwarding to today, as we've done, I think, pretty well in this group, I appreciate the way you guys are thinking throughout history, both backward and forward. And so in light of that, how could the church become one that Martin Luther King Jr. would be proud of? And I'll start with you, Karen.
You're going to start with me?
It's your turn. I got caught by surprise.
My turn? You want to know what the church is going to do? Is that what your question is?
The question is, how can the church become one that how could it of it then and maybe today as well, however you want to look at the perspective there of how could the church become one that MLK would be proud of?
I think we need to become more involved in social justice. I think we need to know, we need to put on other people's shoes and walk into their shoes so that we understand, because not only are the Blacks having a hard time, but you have the Native Americans, you even have some of the white population that's having issues that are also part of the Blacks and the Native Americans and the Chinese, the Asian, and any other ethnic group. So I think we need to learn how to walk in other people's shoes. And I think that's what Jesus was telling us to do, that we need to do more of that, and then maybe we can move on into social justice.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think the thing about that, though, is it takes intentionality, because I think I was thinking about kind of over my high school and college and seminary life, and without intentionality as a white person, my circles get wider and wider, especially as I get more and more educated. I think especially like graduate school was a majority white, college was a majority white. The high school that I was in was even white, like because of redlining. That's, a way back history before I was born. But and then like the church I went to was a majority white. The extracurricular activities I was in was a majority white. And so, and even the neighborhood I was in was a majority white. And so I think, even the places in my life, if I'm not intentional about joining groups or going to a different high school than the one I did, then they would have gotten whiter and whiter. And so it takes intentionality. And I think something that the church could really use is that the Black church is a really powerful place, not only for Black people, but for white people. And I think there's a lot of churches in Buffalo that we could partner with and learn from. And I think I think that's one really easy way for us to be intentional together, is to say, hey, we are all Christians, or we are all followers of Christ. Could you come and stand in our pulpit, which for some churches might be the first African-American person to ever stayed in those pulpits. And I think that's really important to have that partnership. And like you said, you can't really walk in their shoes unless you get to know them. And I think partnerships within churches is a very easy way that I think we could make Dr. Martin Luther King proud. Is by inviting them to our churches, and by inviting us to go to their churches and doing like pulpit swaps or Bible studies, or I don't know, and even just like fellowship events.
It comes down to relationships, just like your marriage life, your friend's life. It all comes down to relationships. Paul has take food, if I have this correct, to some black church on Genesee Street, on Clinton Street. And he has said that maybe that would be nice if I'm not putting words in your mouth, put maybe some sort of relationship with them that, that every so often we get together or we do something with them. So, and I know that Lynn has gone to a couple of black churches. She has some friends that she has gone. I don't remember where they are. Is that the ones on Michigan, Lynn?
Yeah, it's an AME church on the corner of Michigan and Clinton.
Oh, wow.
My very dear friend goes there. I've been very comfortable in the black community, as Dr. Jim, you too, because we both worked. And as I was just thinking about it, I worked in 3 majority black schools in my career, which was most of my career in those schools. So, well, I take that back, it's 4. So most of my time is working with black people, and I've been very comfortable in those situations. And so I don't have any problem. Many times I've been the only white person in situations. So
But I don't think that's very normal. I think if you ask most white people in America today, I think if you ask them, have you ever been the only white person in a room, or the only white person in a school, or the only white person in a church or something like that, I think very few people would say yes to that, right? I mean, don't you think so?
Yeah, but when you think about the heavy segregation of our educational and religious institutions, which, as we know, has not went away at all after desegregation. In fact, it's increased. We are more segregated now. One study showed we're more segregated now than we've ever been, particularly when we look at major cities. So, taking it as a responsibility to be in relationship. And also, I want to remind us to listen to MLK's call to not be afraid to become the church that we used to be historically, that critiqued government, that when there's civil rights injustices, when our police department have failed to provide a just and safe environment for all people, to not be afraid to critique and be a prophetic voice in the community, instead of silence, which in this final paragraph here, final couple paragraphs, MLK says is really a way of condoning the behavior.
Right.
Silence is not just neutral. It's actually, we're becoming part of the unjust system. And when we think about Micah chapter 6, that's literally the opposite of what we've been called to do as Christians.
Yeah, and I think especially sometimes the people who sit by silently, like when an injustice is done, almost hurts more than the actual injustice. Like, I'm not saying like I've been unjust, but I had been bullied, in high school and middle school. And the fact that like, I just remember looking around and like seeing my teacher not call it out and not be like, hey, stop making fun of her or stop whatever, to me was almost more hurtful than like what actually was done to me. The fact that like they did this in the public sphere, there's 30 other people and a teacher in the classroom, and no one called it out. Like no one said that shouldn't be done. So I think sometimes even the silent condoning can almost be more harmful than the actual injustice itself, you know?
You know, there's a thing, and I think we will solve this. My father took a course in at CCNY when it was good, he says, City College of New York, in sociology in 1956. And understand, we come from Puerto Rico. We're white Spaniards, but we still come from Puerto Rico. A lot of discrimination in New York in the 50s. I went to a high school, a New York City high school, Forest Hills High School, with 5,000 students. No one was Black. Okay. I mean, when you think about it, New York City, Queens, Forest Hills High School, 5,000 students, no one was Black. So, you know, we have come a ways, but it's been a very rough ride. And the first myth, and I don't know how, because if I propose this in a school, I could get into a lot of trouble one way or another. Race doesn't exist. There is no such thing as race. How do we define race? We don't do it like medical people do it, cross, type, and match. You know, okay, you can take this kidney from this one and you can have this heart from that one. There is no racial divide when it comes to surgery. And so aside from, you know, you have melatonin in the skin. I happen to have a lot less melatonin than Kanye West. Okay. But so is it the amount of melatonin in the skin, which is really defined by the geography and adaptation to sunlight? Or is it a few facial features, you know, like you have the nose and the forehead and whatever, and hair? So are those little things divide us? And, you know, I can tell you that if I had suggested to students either at UB or performing arts that there was no such thing as race, I would have gotten a lot of cross eyes. The second thing is, and I've seen it working at performing arts, magnet schools were invented not to promote arts, which we do at arts. I mean, I'm a docent at the Albright Knox. I have an art degree and a philosophy degree and an English degree. So, you know, I was nicely treated. But we were not designed for the arts. We were designed for integration. The concept for the magnet school was that you take bright, young, artistic Black kids and you take young, artistic white kids and you sit them together. And eventually, after 12 or 13 years, they might begin to like each other. Well, that works. But then within that context, you know, comes busing. That's another issue. So you have busing. And then you have people who go, well, I don't want my kid sitting next to that kid. And they move out of town. So now we have busing in Buffalo, and we're busing Black kids with Black kids to go to Black schools. Then you have superintendents like the one from Amherst, I can't remember his name. He suggested that we could solve a lot of Buffalo's problems. I mean, I was attacked in Buffalo. There were 400 teachers when I was out on sick leave who were out on sick leave because they were permanently maimed. We've moved the problem from the code of the streets to the code of the schools. And a lot of teachers complain about violence in school. I think, isn't that true, Lynn?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and the injuries are serious, broken sternums, and they're not light injuries. And
what are you saying about the guy in Amherst, the superintendent?
Okay, well, he's
about the one that left.
The one that kind of got thrown out, really.
Yeah.
Okay, he suggested.
He had a good idea.
Yeah, he just suggested. Oh no, maybe we're talking about a different. This one suggested. He didn't pass an ordinance. He suggested, and it got into the news, that perhaps the county could save money in terms of all the superintendents for all the districts and, you know, the high administrative costs if, in fact, we consolidated Erie County schools. Well, there were people outside of his house throwing cans at it. He'd go to sleep and they put, bags of feces on his lawn. He had to quit the Amherst district. I think it was Amherst. And he had to leave. And because nobody wanted that in the county. It sounded good. Now I was a union building chairman at Performing Arts and at Emerson. And whenever we would strike, which would be about 2 or 3 times, I would say to Phil Ramore, we're going to win. And he says, how do you know? And I said, because the suburban mayors and leaders will pay anything to keep our kids in the city. Mm. So they will call Albany and say, give them what they want, because we don't want those kids out here. And it's a very sinister system we're dealing with, I think we can win it one at a time. I'm very popular with Black and white students, but it takes a lot of work. And,
well, Dr. Martin, that is a perfect segue as we finish up here tonight. I appreciate all the time you put into this letter. I'm in prayer that this will become a creed and a confession of the Presbyterian Church. That is something that is being considered. It's certainly a document I hold dear in my own call. Being from Birmingham, I see as a prophetic reminder in my own life to not be silent about injustice. But to the point you're making, Dr. Martin, I think we will turn it over to Caitlin to announce what our new topic will be next week. We've kind of, had a very specific focus in this letter and talked about broader issues. Now we're going to open up that broad issue. So Caitlin and I are going to be leading the same time, same channel, but we're inviting our friends from Westminster to come and join the conversation.
Oh, nice.
And Caitlin, I'll let you describe
Yeah, so it's going to be called The Gospel and Race, and it's going to be a 6-week study, and I kind of wanted to give a chance to talk about a lot of different, kind of broadening what we've been talking about, because we've very specifically focused on Martin Luther King, a certain time in history, kind of race then, while still talking about race now. But so next week, Micah and I will be leading a discussion on biblical diversity, how God created diversity and and prefers diversity, and how we're better off as human beings because of diversity. So that'll be the first kind of topic. And then the week after that, a man named Philip Stevens, who is a member of Westminster, who's an anthropologist, he'll be talking about race and the history of race, basically where we started, how race became constructed. As Jim was talking about, race wasn't something that was just it's not in the world naturally. Humans made it up, constructed what race is, and that construction of what race is has changed over time. And also depends a lot about where you live. Like in America, we talk a lot about black white race construction, and leave out a lot of times what Karen was talking about, our Native American siblings, our Asian American siblings, all those kind of other things that just we don't talk about because we just talk about black and white relations. Anyway, so he's going to kind of give a history of the anthropology of race, and then we're going to have one more lecture that we're still kind of like firming up what that is, and then the second half of the series will be more discussion based, because I feel like a lot of us have been talked at a lot with lectures, at least we have at Westminster for sure. And so we'll do 2 discussions on just kind of like, what have you guys been reading? What have you guys learned this summer? Just more discussion based on lecture. And then the last of the 6th series, which will be the last Tuesday night in August, Micah and I will split up back again, and you'll do Lafayette and I'll do Westminster, and we're going to come with actual action items that we want our churches to do. So we have a racial justice committee, and I think you guys have just decided to make a social justice committee, right?
We're forming one.
There you go. You guys are forming the session just approved that Lafayette will have a social justice committee, and this is just kind of a place that I think the best ideas come from big brainstorms, and it's not one that we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of these ideas, but just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, thinking of everything that we could possibly do, and then letting the committee decide whether or not that's something that Lafayette would do or Westminster would do. So that's kind of the next 6 weeks, and it'll be Tuesdays at 6:30, and we'll be together for the first 5 weeks, and then we'll do it separate the last week.
We have a Presbytery meeting next Tuesday.
I know, yeah. The Presbyterian meeting's at 6 o'clock. So we're gonna go for the first little bit, but then have to skip out of the Presbyterian meeting. Yeah.
So we're excited about that new topic. Thank you all for joining both live here on Facebook and on Zoom. I want to leave us tonight with the scripture in connection with this letter, Micah 6:8, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. I know that's our goal, and how we live that out is so important in a world that is full of so much brutality and hatred, and we're called to be witnesses against that. So,
well, and sometimes that can be a little overwhelming. I don't know if you all feel that way, like that scripture verse can sometimes feel a little overwhelming. There seems like there's so much to do. There's so much, I don't know if it's just like the 24-hour news cycle or the fact that globalization of the world, that we're hearing about all these things that are happening all over the world. Whereas I think we would only have heard of that, like, maybe our state, we would hear about before. And so something that I've seen somewhere, I don't know, probably on Facebook, is using that Bible verse and saying like, you can't solve the world's problems, but like just do what's right in front of you. Like do justice now, walk humbly now, love kindness right now, right where you are, right where you're planted. Maybe for somebody that might look like going to do a missionary. Somebody might be a missionary and go somewhere and do something big and great. And sometimes I feel like, oh, I can't do that. But what you can do is you can do justice right where you are. And there's something that for you to do right where you are. And so for me, when I get a little bit overwhelmed, I just think, okay, what's something that I can do right now? Maybe it's not big, maybe it's not going to solve the world's problems, but it's going to make one person's life a little bit easier one day at a time.
Well, it's obvious you're doing a lot.
Well,
it's been an hour of doing, like that's something important.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you all. Have a wonderful
Thank you.
evening, and we'll see you again next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.